The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty Nevada town of Pioche, and Zelda Dalton knew she had reached the end of more than just her journey. She stepped down onto the wooden platform with trembling legs, her black mourning dress collecting red dust that seemed determined to claim everything in this God-forsaken corner of 1875 Nevada. The sun beat down mercilessly, a far cry from the gentle Oregon springs she had known before Samuel died. Before everything fell apart, before she discovered that her husband's mining investment had been nothing but a fool's dream, leaving her with debts that swallowed their entire life savings and then demanded more. The stagecoach driver handed down her single trunk, the last possession she owned outright. Everything else had been sold at auction 3 months ago while neighbors whispered behind their hands and creditors circled like vultures. She had exactly $4.30 to her name, and letters in her reticule demanding payment of $370 to Samuel's business partner, a man named Wendell Crenshaw who supposedly operated a saloon here in Pioche. Zelda straightened her shoulders and looked down the main street. Pioche sprawled before her in all its rough glory, a silver mining town carved into the side of the mountain with more saloons than churches and more gambling halls than proper stores. The sounds of piano music and raucous laughter drifted from multiple establishments, even though it was barely past noon. Miners covered in dust trudged past, eyeing her with curiosity that made her skin prickle. She was 24 years old, had been married for 3 years and widowed for 6 months, and she was completely alone. Gripping the handle of her trunk, Zelda dragged it toward the nearest respectable-looking building, a mercantile with fresh paint and clean windows. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from her ledger as the bell above the door chimed. "Help you, miss. I am looking for Crenshaw's establishment," Zelda said, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman's expression shifted, sympathy flooding her features. "That would be the Silver Dollar Saloon 3 buildings down, but if you are looking for respectable work, dear, I would not recommend seeking it there. I am not seeking employment. I am seeking Mr. Crenshaw regarding a business matter." The woman nodded slowly, but worry remained etched on her face. "Be careful, dear. Wendell Crenshaw is not known for his charitable nature." Zelda thanked her and left her trunk with the woman's promise to keep it safe. She walked the dusty street with her head high, ignoring the stares and crude comments from men lounging outside the saloons. The Silver Dollar was the largest building on the street, 2 stories tall with ornate false fronts and large glass windows that probably cost more than most miners earned in a year. She pushed through the swinging doors into a dim interior that smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and sweat. A dozen men turned to look at her, conversation stopping mid-sentence. The piano player's fingers stuttered on the keys before falling silent. "We do not allow ladies in here during operating hours," a voice called from behind the bar. "Unless you are looking for a particular kind of employment, in which case you will want to speak to Crenshaw upstairs." "I am here to speak with Mr. Crenshaw about my late husband's debt," Zelda announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. A door at the back opened, and a portly man in an expensive suit emerged, his face florid and his eyes calculating. "You must be Mrs. Dalton, your husband's widow. I had wondered if you would have the nerve to show your face here. I received your letters demanding payment." "I have come to discuss terms." Crenshaw laughed, a sound without humor. "Terms? There are no terms. Your husband owed me $370. He invested in a mining claim that was supposed to triple our money. Instead, the claim was fraudulent and we lost everything. I want my money, Mrs. Dalton. I do not have $370. Everything was sold to pay Samuel's other creditors. I came to Pioche because you said in your final letter that if I could not pay, there might be other arrangements." The men in the saloon had gone very quiet now, watching the exchange with interest. Crenshaw smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Other arrangements, indeed. You could work off the debt. I am always looking for pretty girls to serve drinks and keep the customers company upstairs. $370 at current rates would take you about 2 years. Zelda felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this might be what he meant, had known and come anyway because she had nowhere else to go. But hearing it spoken aloud made bile rise in her throat. "I will not do that," she said quietly. "Then I will have the sheriff seize whatever possessions you have and throw you in jail for the debt. You will rot there, Mrs. Dalton, because debtor's prison does not release anyone until the debt is paid, and you cannot earn money while locked up. It is your choice." Before Zelda could respond, the doors swung open behind her with such force they cracked against the walls. Every head turned toward the entrance where a tall figure stood silhouetted against the bright sunlight. "Crenshaw, I believe you need to watch your tongue when speaking to a lady." The voice was deep and carried an edge of steel. As the man stepped inside, Zelda could see him clearly. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard work and harder living. He wore dusty trail clothes, chaps over denim pants, a worn leather vest over a blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. Twin revolvers sat on his hips with the easy familiarity of tools rather than affectations. When he pushed his hat back, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, probably in his late 20s, with striking green eyes and a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. "This does not concern you, Garrett," Crenshaw said, his voice tight. "Seems to me you are threatening a woman who just lost her husband and came here in good faith to settle a debt. That concerns me plenty." Dominic Garrett stepped further into the saloon, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Zelda noticed that several of the other patrons straightened up, and a few nodded respectfully in his direction. Whoever this man was, he commanded respect in Pioche. "She owes me money, Garrett. Her husband invested in a fraudulent claim, and I lost everything. Samuel Dalton invested in the same claim you did, and from what I hear, you were the one who brought the opportunity to him. Seems like you were both taken by the same con man. Why should she bear the burden of your poor judgment?" Crenshaw's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Because her husband signed a promissory note." "Did he?" Dominic turned to Zelda. "Madam, did your husband sign any papers with this man?" Zelda swallowed hard. "I do not know. He did not discuss his business dealings with me in detail." "Convenient," Crenshaw spat. "The note is in my safe." "Not that I need to prove anything to you, Garrett." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "Show me the note." "I do not have to show you a damned thing." "Then I am calling your bluff. This lady does not owe you anything, and you are trying to intimidate her into working in your brothel. That makes you lower than the snakes that crawl through this desert." Crenshaw's hand moved toward something behind the bar, but Dominic's hand was already on his revolver. He did not draw it, just rested his palm on the grip in a casual gesture that somehow conveyed absolute readiness. "I would not," Dominic said quietly. The entire saloon held its breath. Finally, Crenshaw slowly moved his hand back to the bar top. "Fine, you want to see the note. I will get the damned note." He disappeared into the back room, and Zelda found herself standing frozen, unsure what was happening or who this Dominic Garrett was or why he had stepped in to defend her. When Crenshaw returned, he slammed a piece of paper on the bar. Dominic picked it up, studying it carefully. Zelda watched his eyes move across the page, then narrow. He held the paper up to the light streaming through the window. "This is a forgery," he said flatly. "What? That is Samuel Dalton's signature, maybe, but the date on this document is from 2 months after Dalton died. I know because I was there when we buried him after his wagon accident up in the hills. That was April. This is dated June. You created this note after he was already dead, Crenshaw." The saloon erupted in murmurs. Crenshaw's face went from red to white. "You cannot prove that." "The date proves it. Everyone in this room can see it. You tried to fabricate a debt to force this woman into your brothel. That is fraud and attempted kidnapping." Dominic's voice had gone cold. "Now here is what is going to happen. You are going to apologize to Mrs. Dalton, and you are going to tear up this fake promissory note, and you are never going to contact her again. And in return, I will not take this to the sheriff and see you hanged for fraud." For a long moment, Crenshaw said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He took the paper from Dominic and tore it in half, then quarters, then eighths. The pieces fluttered to the bar top like dying moths. "I apologize, Mrs. Dalton," he said through gritted teeth. "There is no debt." Zelda could barely breathe. The weight that had pressed on her chest for months suddenly lifted, leaving her dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not sure if she was speaking to Crenshaw or to the stranger who had saved her. Dominic turned to her, his expression softening. "Madam, would you allow me to escort you out of here?" She nodded mutely and let him guide her toward the doors. As they stepped outside into the brilliant afternoon sunshine, her legs suddenly gave way. Dominic caught her before she fell, his arms strong and steady. "Easy now." "When is the last time you ate something?" Zelda tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think." He said something under his breath that might have been a curse. "Come on. The boarding house serves a good meal and you look like you are about to collapse." "I cannot afford the boarding house. I have less than $5. I am buying. Consider it payment for letting me have the satisfaction of putting Crenshaw in his place. I have been waiting for an excuse to do that for 2 years." He guided her down the street to a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign reading Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Inside, the proprietor, the same woman from the mercantile Zelda had met earlier, took one look at her and started fussing. "Oh, you poor dear. Sit down, sit down. I will bring you some beef stew and fresh bread." Within minutes, Zelda found herself seated at a clean table with a steaming bowl in front of her. Dominic sat across from her, removing his hat to reveal dark brown hair that needed a trim. Now that she could see him clearly in good light, she noticed the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He was watching her with concern. "Eat slowly," he advised. "You will make yourself sick if you go too fast." She obeyed, taking small bites of the rich stew. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, though that might have been the hunger talking. Mrs. Patterson brought coffee and bread with butter, and Zelda ate methodically until the bowl was empty and the gnawing ache in her stomach had eased. "Thank you," she said finally. "I do not know why you helped me, but thank you." Dominic shrugged. "I do not like men who prey on people in bad circumstances, and Crenshaw has been getting too big for his britches lately. He needed to be reminded that there are still some lines you do not cross." "Who are you? I mean, I know your name is Dominic Garrett, but people in that saloon knew you. They respected you." "I own a cattle ranch about 5 miles outside town. Been here for 6 years building up the herd. I came into town today for supplies." He paused, then said gently, "Mrs. Patterson told me you were asking about Crenshaw. I figured you might be walking into trouble, so I waited outside until I heard what was being said." "You were eavesdropping." "I was making sure a woman alone did not get taken advantage of. Seems like my instincts were right." Zelda studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. His face was honest, open. She had spent the last 6 months dealing with creditors and lawyers and men who looked at her like she was something to be used or exploited. This man looked at her like she was a person. It was both refreshing and unsettling. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Do you have family you can return to?" "No. My parents died of fever when I was 16. I have a brother somewhere in California, but we lost touch years ago. Samuel was all I had, and now—" She trailed off, the reality of her situation crashing back down on her. "I have nowhere to go. I came to Pioche because I thought I had to settle the debt, but now that there is no debt, I suppose I could try to find work somewhere. Though I am not sure what work I am qualified for." "Can you read and write?" "Yes, of course. And I can do figures. I kept the books for Samuel's freight business before the mining investment." Dominic nodded slowly, an expression of concentration on his face. "Mrs. Patterson, how much for room and board for a week?" $3 for the week, including meals," the older woman called from the kitchen. Dominic pulled out his billfold and counted out several bills. "Here is payment for 2 weeks for Mrs. Dalton, with my compliments." "Mr. Garrett, I cannot accept that," Zelda protested. "Already done. You need a place to stay while you figure out what comes next. 2 weeks gives you time to recover from your journey and look for honest work." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I have to finish my supply run, but I will check in tomorrow to make sure Crenshaw is leaving you alone." Before Zelda could protest further, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. She stared after him in bewilderment. Mrs. Patterson came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "That Dominic Garrett is one of the good ones," she said warmly. "Came here 6 years ago with nothing but a handful of cattle and a dream. Built his ranch up from dirt. He is fair to his men, pays his debts, and does not tolerate nonsense. If he has taken an interest in making sure you are safe, you are in good hands." Zelda nodded, though she felt strange accepting such charity from a man she had just met. Still, she was exhausted and heartsick and desperately grateful not to be facing another night sleeping on a stage coach bench or in a stable. Mrs. Patterson showed her to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. Zelda's trunk was already there, delivered by someone. She sank down on the bed, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not the silent tears she had shed in the night when creditors were pounding on her door, but great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Samuel, for the life they had planned, for her lost security, and finally, for the sheer, overwhelming relief that she was not going to end up in Crenshaw's brothel. When the tears finally stopped, she washed her face and lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of bacon drifting up from downstairs. The next week passed in a strange sort of limbo. Zelda spent her days walking around Pioche, inquiring about work. There were precious few opportunities for a respectable woman. The town had no school yet, so teaching was not an option. The 2 dress shops had no need for additional seamstresses. The newspaper office had no work for anyone, much less a woman. The mercantile had all the help it needed. Each evening she returned to the boarding house dispirited, and each evening Dominic Garrett was there waiting at the dinner table. He never made a fuss about it, just happened to be in town for one reason or another and stopped by for a meal. They talked during those dinners, cautious conversations at first that gradually deepened. She learned that he had been born in Colorado, that his parents had died when he was 18, leaving him nothing but debts and bad memories. He had worked as a ranch hand for years, saving every penny until he could afford to buy land and start his own herd. She learned that he had fought in the final years of the Civil War, though he did not like to talk about it. She learned that he loved this wild Nevada land with its harsh beauty and endless sky. He learned that she had married Samuel when she was 21, that it had been a practical marriage more than a passionate one, though they had been fond of each other. He learned that she loved books and missed having access to a library. He learned that she had always wanted to see the ocean, but had never traveled beyond Oregon and Nevada. On the 8th day, Dominic rode into town earlier than usual and found Zelda sitting on the boarding house porch looking dejected. "No luck finding work?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "None. I am beginning to think I will have to try my luck in a different town, though I do not have enough money for stagecoach fare." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, watching the activity on the street. Finally, he said, "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Dalton, and I want you to hear me out before you say anything." Zelda tensed. She had heard propositions before, and they never ended well for women in her position. As if reading her mind, Dominic held up his hand. "Not that kind of proposition, a business arrangement." He took a deep breath. "My ranch is growing, and I need help with the books. I have 3 men working for me now, and I am terrible at keeping track of wages and expenses and inventory. I also need someone who can cook decent meals for the crew and maybe help organize the disaster that is my house. I would like to hire you for those jobs." Zelda blinked. "You want to hire me as a bookkeeper and housekeeper, and cook if you can manage it. The pay would be $15 a month plus room and board. You would have your own room in the house, completely private. My foreman can act as chaperone, so there would be no question of impropriety. It is hard work, but it is honest work, and you would be safe." "Why?" The question came out more bluntly than she intended. "Why are you doing this for me?" Dominic met her eyes steadily. "Because you need help, and I need help, and it seems foolish for both of us to struggle alone when we could help each other. And because I will be damned if I let Crenshaw or anyone else in this town see you fail after you have fought so hard to survive." There was something in his voice, a fierce protective note that made her heart skip. She barely knew this man, but he had shown her more genuine kindness than anyone had in months. "What if I am terrible at cooking?" she asked. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then we will all learn to appreciate burned biscuits. What do you say, Mrs. Dalton? Will you come work for me?" Zelda looked out at the dusty street, at the town that had almost destroyed her, and then back at this man with his honest green eyes and his calloused hands and his unexpected offer of salvation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will come work for you." 2 days later, Zelda rode out to the Garrett ranch in a wagon loaded with her trunk and supplies. Dominic drove, pointing out landmarks along the way. The ranch was nestled in a valley with hills rising on 3 sides and a creek running through the property. The house was modest, a single-story structure built of wood and stone with a wide porch and a roof that looked like it had been recently repaired. Behind it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various outbuildings. 3 men emerged as the wagon pulled up. Dominic introduced them. His foreman Jack, a grizzled man in his 50s with kind eyes. Pete, a young cowboy barely 20 who could not stop blushing when Zelda smiled at him. And Carlos, a Mexican vaquero who had worked ranches his whole life and greeted Zelda with courtly manners that would have done a Spanish don proud. "Mrs. Dalton will be keeping our books and helping with the house," Dominic announced. "I expect everyone to treat her with respect and give her any help she needs settling in." The men nodded, all 3 of them looking relieved. Jack muttered something about finally having someone who could actually cook, which made the others laugh. Dominic showed Zelda to her room, which was small but clean with a sturdy bed, a dresser, and a washstand. The window looked out over the valley, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. "The main room is through that door," Dominic said, gesturing. "Kitchen is attached. My room is on the other end of the house. Jack sleeps in the bunkhouse with the others, but he is usually around during the day if you need anything and I am out working." "This is perfect," Zelda said honestly. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Call me Dominic. We are not formal out here. Then you should call me Zelda." He smiled, and she realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Zelda it is. Welcome to the Garrett Ranch. Those first weeks were hard work." Zelda had not been lying when she said she could keep books, but Dominic's records were in such disarray that it took her days just to sort through the mess and figure out what he actually owned, what he owed, and what was owed to him. She worked at the kitchen table each morning while the men were out with the cattle, organizing receipts and invoices and scribbling columns of figures. The cooking was more challenging. She could manage basic meals, but feeding 4 hungry men who worked from dawn to dusk required more skill than she possessed. Her first attempt at biscuits came out hard as rocks. The men ate them anyway, soaking them in gravy and pretending they were fine. Her beef stew was too salty. Her coffee was too weak, but she learned. Mrs. Patterson had given her a basic cookbook, and Carlos's wife came by twice in those first weeks to show her how to make tortillas and beans the way the men liked them. Slowly, her meals improved from barely edible to adequate to actually good. The housework was familiar territory. She cleaned and organized, washed clothes and mended torn shirts, swept floors and beat rugs. The house began to feel like a home rather than a bachelor's dwelling, and through it all, she was constantly aware of Dominic. He rose before dawn each day, working alongside his men even though he owned the ranch. He fixed fences and branded cattle and broke horses with patient skill. He came in each evening dusty and exhausted, but always asked how her day had been, always thanked her for the meal, always treated her with careful respect. Sometimes, she would look up from her ledgers to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Sometimes their hands would brush when passing a plate at dinner, and she would feel a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the growing warmth in her chest whenever he was near. She told herself it was gratitude. He had saved her from Crenshaw and given her honest work and a safe place to live. Of course, she felt warmth toward him. But late at night, lying in her bed and listening to the coyotes howl in the hills, she knew it was more than gratitude. She found herself noticing the way his hair curled at his collar, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at something Pete said, the way his hands were gentle when he treated a wounded horse. She noticed how he always made sure she had the most comfortable chair at the table, how he brought her wildflowers once saying he had just happened to pass a nice patch, how he casually mentioned that he was expanding his small collection of books if she had any recommendations. It terrified her, these feelings. Samuel had been dead less than a year. She was living under Dominic's roof, dependent on his charity disguised as employment. She had no business developing feelings for him, no business imagining what it might be like if those accidental touches lingered, if those long looks across the dinner table meant what she hoped they might mean. So she pushed the feelings down and focused on her work, keeping careful boundaries and using his given name only when she could not avoid it, usually calling him Mr. Garrett in front of the men to maintain proper distance. 2 months into her employment, everything changed. Zelda had ridden into Pioche in the wagon with Jack to pick up supplies. While Jack loaded sacks of flour and beans, she stopped by the mercantile to purchase thread. She was just coming out of the store when she nearly collided with Wendell Crenshaw. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, his voice oily. Or should I say, Miss Dalton, I have been doing some research on you. Zelda's blood ran cold. Excuse me. I sent an inquiry to Oregon, to the county where your husband supposedly died. Interesting thing I learned. There is no death certificate on file for Samuel Dalton. Makes a man wonder if you are really a widow at all, or if you are just a woman who ran out on her husband and his debts. That is absurd. Samuel died in April of last year. So you say, but without proof, it is just your word. And your word does not carry much weight against a respected businessman like myself. What do you want, Crenshaw? His smile was predatory. I want what I have always wanted. You, working for me, paying off the debt your husband owed, or supposed husband, I should say. And before you run to Garrett, you should know that I have already filed a complaint with the sheriff about your questionable status. If you cannot prove you are actually a widow, you could be arrested for fraud and intent to avoid legal debts. Zelda felt the world tilt. I have papers. His death certificate. Then you should probably find them. I will give you 3 days. If you cannot produce proper documentation of your husband's death, I will have you arrested, and Garrett will not be able to help you from a jail cell. He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, leaving Zelda standing frozen on the boardwalk. Her mind raced. She had papers. She was certain she had papers. But where? Everything had been such chaos after Samuel's death. The accident had happened on a remote mountain road. His body had been brought back to town by a prospector who had found the wreckage. There had been a funeral, debts to be paid, belongings to be sold. Had she taken the death certificate? Had there even been an official certificate, or had it just been the word of the prospector and the local minister? Jack found her standing there, pale and shaking. Mrs. Dalton, you all right? I need to return to the ranch immediately. Is the wagon loaded? Yes, madam, just finished. The ride back seemed to take forever. Zelda's mind churned through possibilities and problems. If she could not prove Samuel's death, Crenshaw could make her life hell. He had connections in this town, money and influence. He could probably actually have her arrested even if the charges would not stick, and fighting legal battles required money she did not have. When they reached the ranch, she went straight to her room and tore through her trunk. Papers spilled across the floor. Marriage certificate, letters from Samuel, old photographs, receipts from the auction of their belongings. But no death certificate. A knock at her door made her jump. Zelda, Jack said you seemed upset. What happened? Dominic's voice was concerned. She opened the door and he took one look at her face and stepped inside, propriety forgotten. Tell me what happened. She explained about Crenshaw's accusation, watching his face darken with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, jaw clenched. That lying snake. He is making this up because I humiliated him. There is no way you are not a legal widow. But I cannot find the death certificate. I do not even know if there was an official one. The accident happened in the mountains between Oregon and Nevada. A prospector found Samuel's body and brought it to town. The local minister held a funeral, but if there was no official county death certificate, then legally. Legally, Crenshaw cannot prove you are lying any more than you can prove you are telling the truth. It becomes your word against his. Dominic ran a hand through his hair in frustration. There has to be a way to handle this. What town was it where the funeral was held? A place called Millbrook in eastern Oregon. It barely counted as a town, just a trading post and a few houses. We need to send someone there to get official documentation. I will ride out first thing tomorrow. That is a week's journey each way, maybe more. Crenshaw gave me 3 days. Then I will ride fast. He met her eyes, his gaze fierce. I am not letting him take you, Zelda. I do not care what I have to do. The intensity in his voice made her heart race. Why? Why do you care so much about what happens to me? The question hung between them. Dominic opened his mouth, closed it, then said quietly, "Because somewhere between pulling you out of that saloon and watching you reorganize my disaster of a ranch, I started caring about you. More than I should, probably, given that you work for me and you are still in mourning. But I do care, Zelda. I care more than is probably wise." Zelda's breath caught. "Dominic, you do not have to say anything. I know it is too soon. I know you probably do not think of me that way, but I will be damned if I let Crenshaw or anyone else hurt you. So I will ride to Oregon and I will get the proof we need and you will be safe. That is all that matters." He turned to leave, but Zelda caught his arm. "Wait. I do think of you that way. I have been trying not to because it seemed wrong, but I do. When you are gone, I miss you. When you come home, everything feels right again. I do not know what that means or what we should do about it, but you should know that it is not one-sided." Dominic stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and touched her cheek with his calloused fingertips. "I am going to fix this," he said softly. "And when I get back, maybe we can figure out what this means. But right now, you need to stay here, stay safe, and not go into town until I return. Crenshaw will come looking for me. Let him try. Jack has orders to turn away anyone who is not welcome, and Crenshaw is too much of a coward to come out here and face me." Before Zelda could respond, Dominic squeezed her hand once and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She heard him calling for Jack, heard low voices discussing plans. An hour later, she watched from her window as Dominic rode out on his best horse, saddlebags packed for a long journey. The next 3 days were agony. Zelda tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting. She caught herself standing at the window, staring at the road as if she could will Dominic to return faster. On the second day, Crenshaw did come to the ranch. Zelda watched from inside as Jack met him at the property line, rifle cradled casually in his arms. She could not hear what was said, but Crenshaw turned his horse around and left without approaching the house. Jack came back looking satisfied. "That man is all talk and no spine," he said. "He will not bother you while we are here, Mrs. Dalton." But on the third day, when Dominic had not returned and the deadline passed, the sheriff arrived. He was an older man named Morrison, and he looked uncomfortable as he dismounted. "Mrs. Dalton, I am afraid I have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of fraud regarding debts in Oregon." Now, I do not put much stock in Crenshaw's accusations, but the law is the law, and I have to take you in until this gets sorted out. Zelda felt numb as Jack protested, as Pete offered to ride out and find Dominic, as Carlos suggested hiding her in the hills. But she knew that would only make things worse. "It is all right," she said quietly. "I will go with the sheriff. When Dominic returns with the proof, this will all be cleared up." She gathered a few belongings and let Morrison help her into his wagon. The ride to Pioche was silent. He took her to the small jail, a building made of stone with 3 cells in the back. Only one other prisoner was there, a drunk miner sleeping off a bender. Morrison locked her in a cell with obvious reluctance. "I will make sure you get decent meals. And I sent word to Garrett's ranch letting them know where to find you when he returns. I am sorry about this, madam. Politics and money make fools of honest law sometimes." Zelda sat on the narrow cot and tried not to cry. The cell was clean but stark, just the cot, a bucket, and a tiny window too high to see out of. She could hear the sounds of the town outside, laughter and music and people going about their lives while she sat trapped. Night fell. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling and praying that Dominic had found what he needed in Oregon, that he was riding hard toward Pioche, that this nightmare would end soon. Morning came. Morrison brought her breakfast, decent food from the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson had sent it, he said, and refused payment. Word had spread through town about Zelda's arrest, and opinion was divided. Some believed Crenshaw's accusations. Others thought it was a trumped-up charge born of spite. The morning dragged into afternoon. Zelda paced her cell, counting steps, trying not to think about what would happen if Dominic could not find proof. Would she be sent back to Oregon to face trial? Would she be transferred to a territorial prison? The possibilities spiraled darker with each passing hour. Then, late in the afternoon, she heard raised voices in the front office. Morrison saying something about proper procedure, another voice demanding to see the prisoner. Dominic's voice. "I do not care about your procedure, Morrison. I have the papers right here proving she is exactly who she says she is. Now open that cell before I do it myself. Now, Garrett, you need to calm down. I have ridden 4 days straight with barely any sleep, pushed my horse to the breaking point, and nearly killed myself on mountain trails in the dark. I am not calm, and I am not going to be calm until she is out of this cell." Footsteps approached. Dominic appeared, looking wild. His clothes were covered in trail dust, his face was shadowed with exhaustion and several days' worth of beard, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. But he held a leather document case in his hand, and when he saw Zelda, relief flooded his features. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I am fine. Just frightened." "Did you find it?" He held up the case. "Official death certificate for Samuel Dalton, signed by the territorial magistrate in Millbrook. Copy of the accident report from the prospector who found him. Statement from the minister who performed the funeral service. Everything documented and official. You are legally widowed, and Crenshaw is legally a liar." Morrison took the papers, examining them carefully. After several minutes, he nodded. "These look legitimate. I will file them with the territorial court and clear the charges." He produced keys and unlocked the cell door. "You are free to go, Mrs. Dalton. My apologies for the inconvenience." Zelda stepped out of the cell on shaking legs. Dominic was there immediately, his hand at her elbow steadying her. "Can you ride? I want to get you back to the ranch." "Yes. Yes, I can ride." They left the jail to find a crowd gathered outside. Word had spread fast. Mrs. Patterson was there, and Jack and Pete and Carlos. Several townspeople who had no connection to Zelda but just wanted to see justice done. And standing at the edge of the crowd, his face purple with rage, was Wendell Crenshaw. "This is not over, Garrett," he snarled. "You might have won this round, but it is over." Dominic cut him off, his voice carrying across the street. "You forged a promissory note. You made false accusations to the law, and you tried to force an innocent woman into your brothel. Every person here knows what you are, Crenshaw. You have no power over Mrs. Dalton, and you never will. If you come near her again, if you even speak her name, I will make sure everyone from here to San Francisco knows exactly what kind of man you are. Do we understand each other?" Crenshaw looked around at the hostile faces watching him. Whatever he saw there made him take a step back. "Fine. Keep your precious widow. She is more trouble than she is worth anyway." He stalked away, and the crowd began to disperse. Mrs. Patterson hugged Zelda tightly. "Come by the boarding house tomorrow, dear. I want to make sure you are truly all right." The ranch hands gathered around, all talking at once, relieved and celebrating. Dominic helped Zelda onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She was acutely aware of his body pressed against her back, his arms around her as he held the reins. They rode slowly, Dominic's exhaustion evident. The horse was exhausted too, plodding rather than the gallop Zelda suspected they had maintained for much of the journey. "You should not have pushed so hard," she said quietly. "You could have been hurt. I had to get back. You were in jail because of me, because I made an enemy of Crenshaw. You were in jail because Crenshaw is a terrible person who tried to exploit you. That is not your fault. I should have handled it differently back in the saloon. If I had not antagonized him, then I would probably be working in his brothel right now. You saved me, Dominic, twice now." They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The other men took care of the horses while Dominic walked Zelda to the house. At the door, she turned to face him. "You need to sleep. You look ready to collapse." "I will. But first I need to say something." He took a deep breath. "When I was riding to Oregon, all I could think about was getting back to you. And when I was riding back, pushing through the night because I knew you were in that cell, all I could think about was how much I needed to see you safe. Not because you work for me or because I feel responsible for you, but because somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my life." Zelda's heart hammered against her ribs. "Dominic, I know it has only been a few months. I know you are still wearing mourning black. I know this is probably not the right time, but I also know that life is uncertain and short, and wasting time pretending we do not feel what we feel seems foolish." He reached out, taking her hands in his. "I love you, Zelda. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up to Crenshaw in that saloon, refusing to be broken even though you were terrified. And every day since then, I have fallen a little more." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks. "I love you too. I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. Samuel and I had a good marriage, but it was never like this. I never felt like my heart would burst just from seeing someone smile. I never felt like the air was harder to breathe when someone left the room. I do not know what that says about me, falling in love so soon after becoming a widow. It says you are alive and human and brave enough to accept happiness when it is offered. Samuel was a good man, from everything you have told me, and I think he would want you to be happy. I think so too." She squeezed his hands, feeling the calluses and strength in them. "So what do we do now? Now I sleep for about 12 hours. And tomorrow, if you are willing, we start courting properly. I will take you for rides and bring you flowers and do all the things a man is supposed to do when he is trying to win a lady's heart." Zelda laughed through her tears. "You have already won my heart. Then I will try to be worthy of keeping it." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. "Good night, Zelda. Thank you for waiting for me." "Good night, Dominic, and thank you for coming back." He left for his room and Zelda went to hers. She lay in bed, feeling lighter than she had in more than a year. The debt that had hung over her was gone. The threat of Crenshaw was neutralized, and she had found something she never expected to find again: love. The next months unfolded like a dream. Dominic was true to his word, courting her properly despite the fact that they lived under the same roof. He brought her wildflowers and took her riding through the hills. He taught her to rope cattle, and she taught him to appreciate poetry. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. The ranch prospered. With Zelda keeping the books efficiently, Dominic was able to expand the herd and hire 2 more hands. The house became a real home, with curtains in the windows and good food on the table, and laughter echoing through the rooms. In November, Dominic took Zelda back to Pioche for the town's harvest festival. They walked down the main street arm in arm, and Zelda noticed that people greeted her warmly. Mrs. Patterson hugged her and whispered that she had never seen Dominic look so happy. Even Sheriff Morrison tipped his hat respectfully. As they stood watching the dancing in the town square, Dominic leaned close and said, "I have a question to ask you." "What kind of question?" "The kind where I get down on one knee in front of everyone and risk making a fool of myself." Zelda's breath caught. "Dominic, you have been in mourning for over a year. I know some people would say we should wait longer, but I have never been good at following other people's rules." He pulled a small box from his pocket and did indeed drop to one knee right there in the middle of the festival. "Zelda Dalton, you came to Pioche with nothing but debt and determination. You survived things that would have broken most people. You brought order to my chaos and light to my life. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The crowd around them had gone silent, watching. Zelda was aware of dozens of eyes on them, but she could only see Dominic kneeling before her, his heart in his eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Yes, I will marry you." The crowd erupted in cheers as Dominic stood and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her there in front of everyone, a proper kiss full of promise and passion and joy. When they finally broke apart, people were clapping and calling out congratulations. They married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Patterson and the ranch hands stood as witnesses. There was no minister in Pioche at the time, so a circuit judge who happened to be passing through performed the service. Zelda wore a simple blue dress, having put aside her mourning blacks. Dominic wore his best suit and looked so handsome that she could barely focus on the vows. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Dominic kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, standing in the house that had become her home, surrounded by people who had become her family, Zelda felt truly blessed. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch continued to grow into one of the most successful operations in eastern Nevada. Zelda became known not just as Dominic's wife, but as a savvy businesswoman who could negotiate cattle prices with the best of them. Together, they built a legacy. 18 months after their wedding, Zelda gave birth to their first child, a son they named Daniel. He had Dominic's green eyes and Zelda's dark hair, and from his first breath, he owned his father's heart completely. Dominic was a devoted father, teaching Daniel to ride almost before he could walk, taking him out to check fences and gather cattle, sharing the love of the land that had given them all a second chance. 2 years later came twin daughters, Grace and Hannah, who kept the entire household running in circles. They were wild and fearless, climbing trees and chasing chickens and driving their older brother to distraction. Dominic built them a swing under the big cottonwood tree by the creek, and Zelda spent countless afternoons watching her children play while she worked on the ranch accounts. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family. They added rooms and a larger kitchen, a front parlor where Zelda kept her growing library of books, and a wide porch where they sat on summer evenings while the children played in the yard. Life was not without challenges. There were droughts that tested the herd and harsh winters that pushed them to their limits. There were injuries and illnesses and the constant hard work that came with ranching. But they faced everything together, their partnership stronger with each passing year. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dominic took Zelda riding to a hilltop overlooking the ranch. They sat together watching the sun set over the land they had built together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming to Pioche, I mean. Everything you went through before we found each other." Zelda thought about those dark days after Samuel's death, the crushing debt, the fear and uncertainty. She thought about stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but $4 and desperation. And she thought about everything that had come after. Dominic's intervention, their courtship, their marriage, their children, this life they had built together. "No," she said honestly. "All of it brought me here to this moment to you. How could I regret the path that led me home?" Dominic pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Zelda Garrett. I love you too, Dominic Garrett. Forever." They sat together as the stars came out, watching over the valley that held their dreams and their future. In the house below, their children were probably getting into mischief under Jack's watchful eye. The cattle grazed peacefully in the fields. The creek burbled its eternal song. Everything was exactly as it should be. Zelda had come to Nevada with nothing but debt and despair. But she had found something infinitely more valuable than money or security. She had found love, real and lasting and true. She had found a partner who saw her not as a burden to be managed, but as an equal to be cherished. She had found a home, not just in the physical sense, but in the deep soul sense of belonging completely. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. When Daniel was 10, he saved a young calf from a ravine, showing the same courage and compassion his parents had modeled. The twins grew into young ladies who could rope cattle as well as any cowhand while still managing to look presentable for the occasional social events in Pioche. Another son, Samuel, came along 5 years after the twins, named for Zelda's first husband with Dominic's blessing. He had his namesake's gentle nature and grew up to be the scholar of the family, preferring books to cattle, though he never shirked his ranch duties. The ranch became legendary in Nevada, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. Dominic and Zelda were respected throughout the territory, invited to speak at cattlemen's associations and consulted on business matters. But they never forgot where they had started, never forgot the kindness of strangers and the importance of helping those in need. When they learned of a widow in a neighboring county facing similar circumstances to what Zelda had experienced, they quietly paid her debts and helped her find honest work. They did the same for others over the years, establishing a reputation for generosity that matched their reputation for business acumen. Wendell Crenshaw's Silver Dollar Saloon eventually closed down after he was caught cheating at cards one too many times. He left Pioche in disgrace, and no one mourned his departure. The building was purchased by a consortium of local businessmen and converted into a proper hotel, bringing more respectability to the town. Mrs. Patterson remained a close friend until her death at age 72. Surrounded by the community she had served faithfully. At her funeral, Zelda told the story of how the kind boarding house proprietor had kept her trunk safe and offered comfort during the darkest days, crying openly as she spoke. Jack stayed on as foreman until his own death, training first Daniel and then the twins in the art of ranching. He died peacefully in his sleep in the bunkhouse at age 68, and was buried on a hill overlooking the valley he had helped tame. Carlos returned to Mexico after 20 years, leaving with enough money to buy his own small ranch. Pete married a girl from Pioche and started his own spread with Dominic's help, remaining a close friend and neighbor. Through it all, Dominic and Zelda's love remained the foundation of everything. They had their disagreements, of course. Zelda thought Dominic took too many risks with expansions. Dominic thought Zelda was too cautious with investments. They argued about how to discipline the children, about whether to buy new bulls or improve irrigation, about 1,000 small things that married people argue about. But they never went to bed angry. They always talked through problems until they found solutions. And they never stopped seeing each other truly. Never let familiarity breed contempt or comfort breed complacency. Dominic still brought her wildflowers. Zelda still made his favorite meals. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Daniel, now a young man of 18 helping run the ranch, organized a celebration. Friends and neighbors came from miles around. A feast was prepared, music played, children ran wild in the yard. As the sun set, Dominic pulled Zelda aside to the same hilltop where they had sat on their 5th anniversary. 20 years, he said, his green eyes still as bright as the day they met, though his hair now showed silver at the temples. 20 years of waking up next to you. It is not enough. 1,000 years would not be enough. Zelda smiled, touching his face with a hand now marked by work and time but still gentle. We have been blessed beyond measure. 4 beautiful children, a home we built together, a life full of love. I think about that day you stepped off the stage coach sometimes. You were wearing that black dress, looking terrified but determined. I knew right then that you were someone special. I just did not know how special. I think about you walking into that saloon like an avenging angel. I think about how you could have just walked away, let Crenshaw have his victory, but you did not. You stood up for a stranger, and in doing so, you gave me back my life. No, Dominic said softly, you gave yourself back your life. You were strong enough to survive everything that happened before we met. I just had the privilege of being there when you needed help. And you gave me something too, you know. Before you came, I was just existing, building the ranch, working myself to exhaustion, going through the motions of living. But you taught me how to actually live, how to love, how to be truly happy. They held each other as the stars emerged, the sounds of celebration drifting up from the house below. 20 years of marriage, of partnership, of love. And they both knew there would be many more years to come, each one a gift. As they grew older, they gradually turned over more of the ranch's daily operations to Daniel and the twins. Grace had married a neighboring rancher, combining properties in a partnership that benefited both families. Hannah had chosen to stay at the ranch, proving herself as capable as any man at managing cattle and land. Samuel went east to university, studying law, but always returned for summers and holidays, his heart forever tied to the Nevada desert where he had grown up. When Dominic and Zelda were in their 50s, they finally took that trip to the ocean that Zelda had always dreamed about. They traveled to San Francisco, staying in a fine hotel and walking along the beach hand in hand. The ocean was everything Zelda had imagined, and more, vast and powerful and beautiful. But as magnificent as it was, she found herself missing the dry Nevada hills, the sound of cattle lowing, the sight of their grandchildren playing in the yard. Home, Dominic said, reading her thoughts as he so often did. Nothing compares to home. They returned to Pioche to find that the town had grown considerably. There were now proper schools, several churches, a theater, and even talk of a railroad spur. The wild frontier town of their youth had become civilized, though it still retained enough rough edges to remind them of where they had come from. Their grandchildren began arriving, filling the ranch with new life and laughter. Grace had 3 boys who were as wild as their mother had been. Hannah married later in life to a widowed rancher with 2 children of his own, blending families with characteristic efficiency. Samuel married a girl he met at university and brought her back to Nevada, where she fell in love with the land and the life, despite her refined Eastern upbringing. Daniel, their firstborn, grew into a man who was the perfect blend of his parents. He had Dominic's physical strength and skill with cattle, combined with Zelda's head for business and diplomacy. When he was 25, he married the daughter of a territorial judge, and together they continued building the Garrett Ranch into an empire that stretched across thousands of acres. Through the decades, Dominic and Zelda watched their legacy grow not just in land and cattle, but in the values they had instilled in their children and grandchildren. Hard work, honesty, compassion for those less fortunate, and the courage to stand up for what was right even when it cost something. They had created something that would last far beyond their own lives, roots that ran deep into the Nevada soil. The ranch that Dominic had started with a handful of cattle, and a dream had become something magnificent. But more important than any material success was the family they had built together, each member a testament to the power of love and perseverance. On quiet evenings when the work was done, and the grandchildren had been tucked into bed, Dominic and Zelda would still sit together on the porch, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the sky. Sometimes they talked about old times, remembering their first meeting and the challenges they had overcome. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of knowing someone completely. "You know what I realized recently?" Zelda asked one evening as they sat watching the stars appear. They were in their early 60s now, still active but slowing down, content to let the younger generation carry more of the burden. "What is that?" Dominic asked, his voice still warm and deep despite the years. "I realized that I spent the first part of my life being afraid. Afraid of disappointing my parents, afraid of making the wrong choices, afraid of what people thought of me. Then, after Samuel died, I was afraid of losing everything, of ending up destitute, of not being strong enough to survive. But from the moment you walked into that saloon and stood up for me, I have not been afraid. Not really. Oh, I have worried about things, about the children, about droughts and harsh winters and all the normal concerns of life. But that deep, existential fear that used to wake me in the night, it is gone. You gave me that gift, Dominic. You gave me freedom from fear." Dominic squeezed her hand gently. "You gave yourself that gift by being brave enough to accept help, brave enough to love again, brave enough to build this life with me. I was just lucky enough to be there at the right time." It was more than luck. It was fate. Everything that happened, every hardship and heartbreak led us both to that moment in Crenshaw's saloon, and I would go through all of it again, every terrible moment if it meant ending up here with you. They sat together as the night deepened, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and despair. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness, alive with the sounds of night birds and distant cattle, the creek singing its eternal song. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren slept safely, dreaming their own dreams and planning their own futures. The legacy continued, growing stronger with each generation. But at its heart would always be the story of a widow who arrived in Pioche with nothing but debt, and the cowboy who paid it all and called her his. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that come with time. Dominic's hair went completely silver, and though he remained strong, he moved a bit slower, left the breaking of wild horses to younger men, spent more time consulting than doing the physical labor. Zelda's dark hair acquired streaks of gray that she wore proudly, and her hands showed the marks of decades of work, but her mind remained sharp, still managing the books and offering advice on business decisions. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family. Daniel gave a speech about his parents' love story, reducing everyone to tears when he described how his mother had arrived in Nevada broken, and his father had helped her become whole. Grace and Hannah presented them with a hand-stitched quilt made from fabric scraps representing different moments in their life together. A piece from Zelda's first dress after she stopped wearing mourning black, a scrap from Dominic's favorite work shirt, bits from the children's baby clothes, and squares embroidered with scenes from the ranch. Samuel, now a successful lawyer in Carson City, stood and read a poem he had written about love enduring through time and hardship. His Eastern wife, Louise, had adapted wonderfully to Nevada life and was pregnant with their 3rd child. All of the grandchildren performed a song they had practiced, slightly off-key but full of enthusiasm and love. As Zelda looked around at the gathered family, at the house that had grown from a simple ranch dwelling to a sprawling home, at the people who existed because she and Dominic had found each other and built a life together, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what mattered. Not the cattle or the land or the money in the bank, but this: family, love, legacy. "Thank you," she whispered to Dominic as they danced slowly to music played by Pete's son on a fiddle. "For what? For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For standing up for me when no one else would. For loving me when I did not think I could be loved again. For giving me this life, these children, this family." "I should be thanking you for the exact same things," Dominic replied, pulling her closer. "You saved me just as much as I saved you, Zelda. Maybe more. I was becoming hard and isolated before you came. You taught me how to open my heart again." They danced until the music stopped, then kept swaying gently, lost in each other and in the memories of 30 years together. Around them, their family celebrated, the children playing, the adults talking and laughing, everyone bound together by the love that had started in a dusty Nevada town, when a widow met a cowboy and both of their lives changed forever. As they moved into their 70s, Dominic and Zelda settled into a peaceful rhythm. They rose early out of habit, but moved slower, savoring their morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. They took daily walks together, Dominic sometimes using a cane after an old horse injury flared up, Zelda's hand tucked into the crook of his arm. Daniel ran the ranch now with the help of his own grown children. Grace and her husband's combined operations had become one of the largest in Nevada. Hannah had taken over the breeding program and was known throughout the West for producing superior cattle. Samuel returned from Carson City regularly, always arriving with books he thought his mother would enjoy and legal advice for the family business operations. The great-grandchildren started arriving, a new generation with the Garrett name and the values that Zelda and Dominic had worked so hard to instill. They loved having the little ones visit, though the chaos exhausted them faster now. Zelda would read stories to them in the parlor, while Dominic taught the older ones to whittle or identify different types of birds. "We built something good," Dominic said one evening as they sat on the porch watching two of their great-grandchildren chase fireflies in the yard. He was 76 now, his once powerful frame grown thinner, but still carrying the dignity and strength that had first drawn Zelda to him. "We built something wonderful," Zelda agreed. She was 73, her body showing the wear of a life well lived, but her spirit remained vibrant. "When I think about that terrified woman who stepped off the stagecoach in Pioche, I can hardly believe this is the same life. You were never just a terrified woman, you were a survivor, a fighter. I just gave you a safe place to catch your breath and remember your own strength. And you gave me love. Real love, Dominic. The kind of love that stories are written about. The kind that lasts not because it is easy, but because we chose it every single day, even on the hard days." "Especially on the hard days," Dominic agreed. "Those were the days that mattered most." They sat together as night fell, holding hands as they had done for 4 decades. The fireflies danced in the yard, the children's laughter rang out in the darkness, and somewhere in the house, multiple generations of Garretts went about their evening routines. Everything was exactly as it should be. Dominic died peacefully in his sleep 3 months after their 45th wedding anniversary. He was 77 years old and had lived to see his children become successful, his grandchildren grown and starting families of their own, and his great-grandchildren beginning to run wild on the land he had tamed. His funeral was attended by hundreds, people coming from all over Nevada and beyond to pay their respects to a man who had been respected for his fairness, his courage, and his unwavering love for his family. Zelda stood at his grave, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and found that she could not cry. Not because she was not sad. The grief was there, a vast ocean of loss that threatened to pull her under. But also present was gratitude for every moment they had shared, every sunrise they had watched together, every crisis they had weathered side by side, every laugh and kiss and gentle touch across 45 years of marriage. "I will love you forever," she whispered to the fresh-turned earth. "Until I see you again." She lived 3 more years after Dominic's death, years filled with the love of her extensive family. She remained sharp-minded until the end, still offering advice on ranch business, still reading voraciously, still telling stories about the old days to the younger generations who gathered around her chair. On warm evenings, they would find her sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, staring out at the valley with a small smile on her face, and they knew she was remembering a cowboy who had walked into a saloon and changed her life. Remembering a love that had survived everything the world threw at it. Remembering the family they had built together, the legacy they had created. Zelda Garrett died on a clear autumn morning with golden light streaming through her window. She was 80 years old, surrounded by 3 generations of family, holding a photograph of Dominic taken on their 30th anniversary. Her last words were barely audible, but those closest heard them clearly. "I am coming home." They buried her next to Dominic on the hilltop overlooking the ranch, the same hilltop where he had proposed, where they had celebrated anniversaries, where they had shared countless conversations about life and love and dreams. A simple stone marked the spot, carved with both their names and a single line. "Together, always." The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's leadership and was eventually passed to his children. Grace's combined operation became one of the most successful in the American West. Hannah's breeding program produced cattle that were sought after across the country. Samuel's legal career took him all the way to the territorial Supreme Court before Nevada gained statehood, and then to the state legislature, where he helped shape Nevada's future. But more important than any business success or professional achievement was the family that continued to grow and flourish. At gatherings, the story was always told of how it had all begun, with a widow who arrived in Pioche with nothing but debt, and a cowboy who paid it all and called her his. It became family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder of where they had come from and what truly mattered. The values Dominic and Zelda had lived by became woven into the fabric of the family. Work hard, deal fairly, help those in need, stand up for what is right, and above all, love fiercely and without reservation. These principles guided the Garretts through the changing decades, through economic booms and busts, through wars and peace, through the transformation of the Wild West into the modern American West. The ranch itself became a landmark, one of the few original homesteads that remained in family hands through multiple generations. The original house was preserved and expanded, with the room where Zelda had stayed that first night kept almost exactly as it had been, a small museum to the beginning of the family's story. On the hilltop where Dominic and Zelda were buried, their descendants planted cottonwood trees that grew tall and strong, providing shade and shelter just as the couple had provided for their family. The creek that ran through the property continued to sing its eternal song, watering the land and sustaining the cattle, and reminding everyone who heard it of the persistence and endurance that had characterized their ancestors' love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Nevada hills in a blaze of gold and red, family members swore they could see 2 figures standing on that hilltop, hand in hand, looking out over the valley they had loved and the legacy they had created. Perhaps it was just tricks of light and shadow, or perhaps love really did endure beyond death, as eternal as the land itself. The story of Zelda and Dominic became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative nature of love. It reminded every generation that came after that the best legacies are not built on wealth or power, but on love shared and kindness given and courage shown in the face of adversity. In a world that often seemed focused on individual achievement and material success, the Garretts remained grounded in the values their ancestors had embodied. They helped neighbors in need, stood up against injustice, treated everyone with dignity and respect, and understood that true wealth was measured in relationships and love rather than land and money. The original stagecoach stop where Zelda had arrived no longer existed, torn down decades ago as Pioche grew and changed. But the silver dollar building, converted into the hotel, still stood with a plaque telling its history. Locals and tourists alike would read about how it had once been a saloon, where a confrontation between a conniving owner and a desperate widow had sparked a love story for the ages. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house became a museum dedicated to Pioche's history, with an entire room devoted to the Garrett family's contributions to the area. Letters between Zelda and Dominic were preserved under glass, their words of love and devotion still touching hearts more than a century after they were written. The story spread beyond the family, beyond Pioche, beyond Nevada. Writers discovered it and penned articles and eventually books. It became part of the mythology of the American West, alongside stories of cowboys and gold rushes and railroad tycoons. But unlike so many Western legends that focused on violence and conquest, this was a story about love conquering adversity, about kindness transforming lives, about two people finding each other and building something beautiful together. And through it all, the essential truth remained. Zelda Dalton had arrived in Pioche, Nevada in 1875 with nothing but debt and despair. Dominic Garrett had seen her not as a problem to be exploited, but as a person to be helped. He had stood up for her when she could not stand up for herself. He had offered her honest work and respect and eventually his heart. She had accepted all three and given him her heart in return. Together they had built a ranch, raised a family, created a legacy that endured for generations. They had proved that love was not just about grand romantic gestures, but about choosing each other every day, about working side by side through challenges, about building something lasting that would outlive them both. Their story had a beginning in that dusty saloon, a middle filled with hard work and joy and raising children and building dreams, and an ending on a hilltop overlooking the land they loved. But in another sense, it had no ending at all. It continued in every child who bore their name, in every value they had instilled, in every act of kindness performed by someone who had heard their story and been inspired. The widow had arrived with nothing but debt. The cowboy had paid it all and called her his. And from that simple act of decency had grown love, family, legacy, and a story that would never truly end as long as people believed in the transformative power of love and compassion. On the ranch, life went on as it always had and always would. Cattle grazed in fields watered by the creek that sang its eternal song. Children grew and learned, and eventually became parents and grandparents themselves. The land endured through droughts and floods, through changing economies and shifting cultures, a constant reminder of what could be built when two people worked together toward a common dream. And on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the Nevada sky in shades of gold and crimson, if you listened carefully, you might hear whispers on the wind. The voices of a widow and a cowboy who had found each other against all odds, who had loved each other without reservation, who had built something that would last far beyond their mortal years. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their legacy secure. Together always, just as the gravestone promised, just as love itself promised when it was true and real and eternal.